Chapter 1. Donald Trump signed the executive order with a flourish. The roar of the crowd outside the White House faded into a dull hum as President Donald Trump signed the executive order with a flourish, the gold-tipped pen gliding across the page as flashbulbs erupted around him. Standing in the Rose Garden, framed by flags and flanked by his loyal cabinet members, Trump held up the signed document like a trophy. "We are returning education to the states where it belongs," he proclaimed, his voice booming with conviction. It was a moment long in the making. The dismantling of the Department of Education, a seismic promise made and remade on the 24 campaign trail, was now officially underway. Behind him stood Secretary of Education Linda McMahon, a picture of polished resolve and unwavering loyalty. She nodded as the crowd cheered, her presence symbolic of the administration's posture, bold, unapologetic, and ready for battle. Later, speaking with reporters, McMahon was candid. "It won't be easy," she admitted, brushing aside the early criticisms with a confident smile, "but we are confident we can work with Congress to streamline and refocus education at the state and local level. Washington has failed our children for too long." Within Republican circles, the mood was electric. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise called the move a generational correction, and Senator Josh Hawley praised the order as a return to constitutional principles. Conservatives lauded the dismantling of federal bureaucracy, casting it as a long overdue end to a bloated agency they blame for overreach, inefficiency, and stagnant academic outcomes. Think tanks and right-wing commentators flooded the airwaves, arguing that decentralization would empower parents, restore local control, and foster innovation unshackled by federal red tape. But the celebratory mood was met with swift and thunderous backlash from Democrats and public education advocates. Within moments of the signing, the storm of outrage gathered force. Senator Chuck Schumer, his face grim and his tone cutting, addressed the press on Capitol Hill. "This is a disaster," he exclaimed, gripping the podium as a wall of cameras focused in. "Trump is playing politics with our children's future. This isn't about reform, it's about abandonment. Property taxes will skyrocket to cover the costs, and school quality will plummet in states that can't afford the burden. We will see inequality explode across district lines. Rural and low-income communities will be decimated." His words echoed across media platforms, instantly cutting into the celebratory narrative unfolding on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue. Other Democratic voices followed suit, labeling the move as reckless, dangerous, even vindictive. Education unions mobilized rapidly, organizing press conferences, protest rallies, and legal challenges. The National Education Association issued a statement within the hour condemning the action as a full-scale assault on public education, while the ACLU and several civil rights organizations warned of the disproportionate impact the shift would have on minority and disabled students. Cable news scrambled to keep up. Conservative outlets showed celebratory clips from the Rose Garden, interspersed with glowing graphics and slogans like "Power Back to the People." The liberal channels displayed graphics of red state versus blue state funding disparities, and interviews with panicked teachers and administrators warning of classroom overcrowding, vanishing resources, and chaos in state departments ill-equipped to absorb the functions of a now-defunct federal entity. The polarization was immediate, fierce, and total. Inside the White House, Trump remained unfazed. Watching the coverage with Caroline Leavitt and Chief of Staff Kash Patel, he gestured at the screen. "They're screaming because they know they've lost control," he said. "This is exactly why we did it." Leavitt nodded, already working with communications teams to roll out a media blitz emphasizing success stories from states that had been granted early waivers in preparation for the decentralization. Patel, reviewing internal memos from Republican governors who had lobbied for the decision, noted that many were already pushing legislation to fast-track localized education reforms, vowing to reduce administrative costs and redirect funds directly into classrooms. But Trump's inner circle also understood the fight was just beginning. Legal challenges were inevitable. Funding battles in Congress would turn every appropriations hearing into a referendum on the president's education policy. Swing state governors would come under immense pressure to either support or resist the reform, and school boards would become the newest front lines in the culture war. Yet for Trump, this was precisely the fight he wanted. Bold, controversial, and deeply symbolic, the move wasn't just about education. It was about fulfilling his promise to dismantle what he saw as the failed machinery of the Washington elite. In his mind, the Department of Education represented everything wrong with federal bureaucracy: bloated, inefficient, and out of touch with the needs of ordinary Americans. With one signature, he had not only changed the structure of American education, he had redefined the political landscape. And for better or worse, the country would now have to navigate a future in which one of the most significant institutions in the federal government had vanished overnight. The battle over what came next had already begun. Chapter 2. Lindsey Graham and Josh Hawley rallied behind the president. His words were echoed by House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who, standing beside a cluster of impassioned House Democrats, made no attempt to hide his fury. "We will fight this tooth and nail," he declared, his voice rising above the din of flashbulbs and murmuring reporters. "This is not about education, it's about dismantling a vital institution for political gain. President Trump isn't decentralizing power. He's detonating a national standard, leaving students in poorer states to fend for themselves, while he claims some hollow victory over bureaucracy." The opposition was swift, vocal, and unrelenting. Within hours, a coalition of Democratic lawmakers introduced a legislative package aimed at restoring certain federal education functions under new oversight mechanisms, though they knew the odds of passage were slim in the current congressional landscape. The initial skirmishes played out predictably. Republican senators like Lindsey Graham, Jim, and Josh Hawley quickly rallied behind the president, taking to the airwaves and social media with thunderous support. "This is a win for parents, a win for the Constitution, and a win for common sense," Graham said during an appearance on Fox News, calling the Department of Education a monument to top-down failure. Hawley, never one to miss a populist flashpoint, went further, proclaiming that this move marked the beginning of the end of federal control over family life. Republican governors in red states lined up to praise the decision, issuing executive orders of their own to establish new education oversight boards at the state level, designed to implement policy frameworks free from what they described as federal indoctrination. And the House and Senate, both under GOP control after the 24 elections, voted swiftly and predictably along party lines, clearing the path for the formal dismantling of the Department of Education. Votes were accompanied by speeches praising state sovereignty and warning against the dangers of centralized educational mandates. And while there were muted concerns behind closed doors about implementation logistics and long-term funding shifts, no Republican lawmaker wanted to be seen hesitating on what had become a defining wedge issue for the party base. Yet not all voices within the Democratic leadership were ready to quietly lick their wounds. Chuck Schumer, simmering with righteous anger and bolstered by a growing chorus of education advocates and civil liberties groups, wasn't ready to concede an inch. To him, the executive order and its rapid codification through Congress represented more than a controversial policy shift. It was an existential threat to democratic governance. Schumer believed, deeply and instinctively, that Trump had overstepped, not just in dismantling a department, but in redefining the scope of executive power itself. He saw a pattern, first with immigration, then the Department of Education, and what he feared would come next: the environment, labor, healthcare. In Schumer's eyes, Trump was building a new precedent, using executive orders as blunt instruments to knock down institutions that had long been shielded by bipartisan consensus and constitutional caution. In a fiery floor speech before the Senate, Schumer thundered, "The president has not just signed an order, he has launched an assault on the structure of our republic. We have checks and balances for a reason. This isn't executive leadership, it's executive overreach." And the speech drew scattered applause from his caucus and lit up progressive media, but it also underscored the reality of the moment. Outrage alone wouldn't reverse what had been set in motion. Still, Schumer began building alliances. He reached out to moderate Republicans increasingly uneasy with Trump's pace and style of governance, quietly probing for any who might be persuaded to support legal challenges or hearings on constitutional limits. At the same time, Democratic-aligned legal groups began preparing lawsuits, arguing that dismantling an entire federal department required more than an executive order and a party-line vote, that it required a constitutional amendment or, at minimum, judicial review on the grounds of federalism and the rights of marginalized students. Behind the scenes, the makings of a legal showdown began to take shape, one that would soon pull the courts into yet another partisan tempest. But even as the battle lines formed anew, one reality remained clear. Trump had fundamentally altered the landscape, Education policy, long a third-rail issue marked by gradual reforms and cautious debate, had become a defining battleground in the war over federal power, state rights, and the future of American democracy. And no matter what happened next, the country would not return to the status quo. Not now, not ever. Chapter 3. Jeffries and a fiery Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He huddled with Hakeem Jeffries and a fiery Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a dimly lit office on Capitol Hill, the walls lined with decades of legislative history, a silent reminder of the institutions now under threat. The mood was tense, the air thick with urgency as papers rustled and aides moved quietly outside the door. "We can't let this stand," Schumer insisted, his voice tight with frustration and conviction. "This isn't just about education anymore. This is about checks and balances, about preserving the very structure of American democracy. We need to challenge this in the courts before it becomes a precedent we can never undo." His eyes darted between his colleagues, searching for the same resolve that burned within him. Across the table, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat upright, a storm behind her eyes. Ever the champion of the underdog, she brought her hand down sharply on the wooden surface, the sound cracking through the room. "He's acting like a dictator," she snapped. "This is a coordinated dismantling of the federal government, and education is just the beginning. If we let him gut a cabinet-level department with the stroke of a pen and a party-line vote, what's next? The EPA, labor, housing? Let's hit him where it hurts, the Supreme Court." And her passion was raw, electrifying, but it was Jeffries who brought the room back to strategy. Measured, pragmatic, his voice was low and deliberate. "It's a long shot," he said, nodding slowly, his eyes narrowed in thought, "but we have to try. We'll file a lawsuit arguing that the president is exceeding his constitutional authority by attempting to dismantle an agency created by Congress without a proper act of Congress to repeal it." He leaned forward, folding his hands. "The Department of Education was created through legislation. It has a mandate. And while Congress has voted to support Trump's move, we believe the process has been fundamentally flawed, rushed, lacking due legislative scrutiny, and vulnerable to judicial review." Schumer exhaled, his expression hardening. "We'll frame it as a constitutional crisis, not a policy dispute. We don't make this about education per se. We make it about the separation of powers. The court needs to see this as an executive power grab, not a culture war battle." AOC nodded vigorously. "And in the meantime, we rally the public. We organize. We amplify the voices of teachers, parents, civil rights groups. We force the media to look past the slogans and see the fallout." Jeffries added, "We'll reach out to legal scholars, bipartisan voices, anyone willing to publicly say this is a step too far." The three leaders knew the odds. The court leaned conservative, the media cycle was already saturated with culture war noise, and Trump's approval ratings were holding. But they also knew this wasn't just another partisan fight. This was about the boundaries of executive power, and whether any president could erase entire federal institutions simply because he willed it. As they left the room, the gravity of their mission was clear. The battle wasn't just for the Department of Education. It was for the soul of the Constitution itself. Chapter 4. Trump, never one to back down from a fight, relished the conflict. The lawsuit became a rallying cry for the Democratic base, a flashpoint that re-energized a fractured coalition still reeling from the loss of the Department of Education. Progressive groups flooded social media with hashtags like #Save Our Schools and #Education Not Erasure, while petitions demanding the reinstatement of federal education oversight garnered millions of signatures in days. Protests erupted across the country, from college campuses to public squares, where teachers, students, and parents marched with signs reading, "Education is a right, not a privilege," and "Hands off our schools." Cable news was consumed by the legal battle, turning constitutional scholars into household names, as nightly panels debated the limits of executive power, the original intent of the department's founding, and the implications for federal authority in other policy arenas. Every motion filed, every legal maneuver became breaking news. For President Trump, the outrage was fuel. Never one to back down from a fight, especially one that gave him a platform to attack his opponents. He leaned into the controversy with relish. At rallies, he tore into Schumer, AOC, and Jeffries with theatrical fury, branding them as elitist obstructionists clinging to a bloated, broken system that had failed America's children. "They don't care about your kids," he bellowed to roaring crowds. "They care about keeping their power. The federal government doesn't know what's best for your family. You do. That's why we shut it down, folks. That's why we gave power back to the states, where it belongs." The crowd, electrified by the defiance, erupted into chants of USA as Trump soaked in the adoration, his message cutting through the chaos like a dagger. But behind the scenes, the political landscape was quietly shifting. While Republican leadership remained united in their public support for Trump's actions, whispers of unease began circulating among the party's more moderate members. Governors from swing states began reaching out privately to express concern over how their state education departments would manage the sudden influx of responsibilities. Congressional Republicans from rural districts started hearing from constituents, parents and educators who weren't aligned with the left, but were nonetheless deeply worried about what came next. They feared that in the absence of federal support, already under-resourced schools in poor, rural, and underserved communities would suffer the most. Programs once funded through the department, school lunches, special education grants, teacher training, now risked being left in bureaucratic limbo, dependent on patchwork state budgets and shifting political priorities. Staffers in moderate Republican offices began drafting quiet memos assessing the political fallout, noting the sudden uptick in letters, emails, and phone calls from constituents expressing alarm. In closed-door meetings, a few GOP senators asked cautious questions about the long-term strategy. How would the transition be managed? Would there be a contingency plan for states that couldn't absorb the responsibilities fast enough? Was there a risk this would alienate suburban voters, particularly independents, who valued stability in their public school systems? These weren't the questions of rebellion, but they were signals of political tremors, signs that even in a moment of triumph, the ground beneath the president's feet was beginning to shift, and everyone in Washington, friend and foe alike, knew one thing for certain: the real consequences of dismantling the Department of Education had only just begun. Chapter 5. Senator Graham, a longtime Trump ally, found himself facing increasing pressure from his constituents. Senator Lindsey Graham, a longtime Trump ally and one of the administration's most consistent defenders on Capitol Hill, found himself in increasingly uncomfortable territory. As the backlash over the dismantling of the Department of Education intensified and the Democratic lawsuit gathered momentum in the courts and the media, the political heat back home began to boil. Constituents in South Carolina, particularly in rural counties where federal education funding had long filled critical gaps, were calling his office with growing anxiety. School administrators voiced concerns about budget shortfalls, parents worried about the loss of special education programs, and even some conservative school boards quietly questioned how they were supposed to manage a sudden overhaul without clear federal guidance. Graham, ever the seasoned operator, knew the lawsuit had a slim chance of succeeding, especially given the conservative tilt of the judiciary. But he also knew that politics was often about perception, and right now, the optics were disastrous. The image of the administration gutting a major federal department, while children, particularly in underserved communities, faced uncertainty, was not one he wanted to defend through another election cycle. With midterms on the horizon and vulnerable GOP senators nervously watching the polling data, Graham made a calculated move. He reached out to Secretary of Education Linda McMahon, requesting a private conversation. McMahon, who had so far held the line with public loyalty to Trump's vision, listened carefully as Graham laid out his concerns. He wasn't calling for a full reversal, far from it. What he proposed was a compromise, a gradual restructuring of the Department of Education rather than a wholesale dismantling, with built-in safeguards to ensure that no student, particularly those in low-income or rural communities, would be left behind in the transition. The department wouldn't be erased overnight. Instead, it would be reformed over a series of phases, each one monitored and evaluated with benchmarks for student outcomes, teacher retention, and state-level accountability. McMahon, caught between her role as Trump's loyal cabinet secretary and a growing personal unease with the political fallout, took Graham's concerns seriously. She had seen the headlines, the protests, the legal filings, but what troubled her more were the quiet warnings from education officials across red states, Trump strongholds, expressing deep concern about implementation. The ideological victory was clear, but the operational reality was far more complex. schools still had to open. Teachers still had to be paid. Kids still needed lunch programs and textbooks. And the federal government, for all its flaws, had been the safety net holding many of those systems together. Later that evening, she brought Graham's message directly to the Oval Office. President Trump, initially dismissive, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed as McMahon spoke. His instinct was to fight. He relished the battle against Democrats and the liberal media. He had no intention of backing down from a policy that had electrified his base and cemented his image as a destroyer of bureaucracy. "Lindsay's worried about headlines," he said, waving a hand. "We're draining the swamp, and this is part of it." But McMahon persisted. She laid out the growing resistance from GOP officials, the vulnerabilities in rural education infrastructure, the risk of alienating swing voters in key Senate races. She emphasized that this wasn't about retreat. It was about recalibration. A gradual drawdown of federal control could still achieve the ideological goals of local empowerment and state-driven reform while avoiding the chaos that would come from an abrupt shutdown. Trump listened. He frowned, tapped his fingers against the desk, and stared out the window for a long moment. The lawsuit, he knew, was unlikely to succeed, but it could drag on for months, maybe years. Even a victory might come too late to avoid political damage. And worst of all, the longer it went on, the more oxygen it gave to his opponents. But if he pivoted now, on his own terms, he could seize the narrative again. A controlled transition could be sold as leadership, as strategic vision. He could say he had listened to the people, adjusted the plan, and was delivering reform responsibly. He could still claim victory, and maybe, just maybe, expand his support beyond his base. He turned back to McMahon, a glint of opportunity in his eye. "All right," he said slowly. "Tell Lindsay I'll think about it, but we don't call it a compromise. We call it a phase-in. My plan, my timeline, we're still getting rid of the department, but we're going to do it smart." McMahon nodded, knowing the needle had just shifted. The war for education wasn't over, but the White House was no longer just playing offense. It was preparing to adapt and to survive. Chapter 6. Trump, ever the dealmaker, saw an opportunity to portray himself as a unifier. Trump, ever the dealmaker and acutely aware of the political optics surrounding the education battle, recognized a rare opportunity to reshape the narrative and, more importantly, to portray himself not only as a disruptor but as a unifier. With the lawsuit gaining traction in the media and the political heat beginning to affect even Republican allies, he made a move few expected. He picked up the phone and called Senator Chuck Schumer. The Senate Minority Leader, stunned by the unexpected outreach, answered with his usual caution, unsure whether this was a genuine overture or a strategic trap. But Trump, sounding uncharacteristically measured, offered something rare, an olive branch. He proposed a series of high-level meetings to discuss potential reforms to the education system, reforms that would maintain his administration's goal of empowering states but include critical safeguards to ensure accountability, equity, and support for vulnerable communities. "Chuck," Trump said, his tone direct but not combative, "we both know the system's broken. Let's fix it. Let's give power back to parents and states, but let's make sure no kid gets left behind." As Schumer, sensing both political risk and potential reward, was cautiously optimistic. He agreed to the talks, but with clear conditions. Any reform would have to preserve civil rights protections, ensure consistent funding for underserved schools, and keep a framework of federal oversight to protect against systemic neglect. What followed was a series of tense, high-stakes negotiations held over several weeks in secure rooms across Capitol Hill and the White House. Trump brought in Secretary McMahon, Caroline Leavitt, and Stephen Miller to serve as his policy vanguard, while Schumer arrived with Hakeem Jeffries, education experts, and civil rights advocates. The atmosphere was frequently fraught, with moments of near collapse as each side fought fiercely to protect their political principles. Trump's team insisted on stripping down federal bureaucracy and giving states autonomy over curriculum and spending priorities. Schumer's team demanded enforceable benchmarks and federal guardrails to prevent states from abandoning underserved populations. At times, the discussions veered into shouting matches. At others, unlikely moments of agreement emerged as both sides acknowledged that the federal education system had grown bloated and inefficient, while also recognizing the moral imperative to protect the nation's most vulnerable students. Gradually, piece by piece, a framework began to take shape. Neither side got everything they wanted, but both got something real: The Department of Education would not be dismantled, but it would be significantly streamlined. States would gain greater authority over curriculum development, testing standards, and funding allocation, with the freedom to innovate and adapt their policies to local needs. In exchange, the federal government would maintain oversight through mandatory civil rights audits, funding equity metrics, and intervention authority in cases of systemic neglect or discrimination. A new division within the department would be created to oversee state-level compliance and ensure transparent reporting mechanisms for parents, teachers, and students. When the final language was agreed upon and the bill reached the floor, it passed with surprising speed. The lawsuit was officially withdrawn as part of the legislative agreement, and what could have become a drawn-out constitutional showdown instead became a legislative triumph, one that reshaped American education without tearing down the system entirely. Trump signed the bill in a ceremony that blended victory with pragmatism, standing at the podium beside Secretary McMahon and, in a remarkable political image, alongside Chuck Schumer and a bipartisan delegation of lawmakers. This, Trump declared, holding up the signed legislation, is what leadership looks like. We fought, we argued, and then we delivered. For the states, for the schools, for the students. This is how you make America great again, together. Schumer, for his part, offered a tempered endorsement. We didn't agree on everything, but we stood up for what matters: accountability, access, and opportunity for all kids, no matter their zip code. And the media, caught off guard by the rare bipartisan outcome, scrambled to adjust their tone. Pundits praised the deal as a rare instance of functional governance in a divided era. Critics from both fringes grumbled. Hardliners on the left accused Schumer of caving to Trumpism, while right-wing purists complained that the federal government hadn't been dismantled far enough. But the center held. Caroline Leavitt, standing just off stage, watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. They had played the long game, weathered the storm, and emerged not only victorious, but transformed. Trump hadn't just steamrolled the opposition. He had brokered a national compromise. The White House had reclaimed the narrative, and the president had shown a flash of something his critics claimed he lacked: statesmanship. The system had been bruised, shaken to its core, but it had also adapted, and for now at least, it had held. The fight for the future of education was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't being waged in the courts. It was being shaped, rewritten, and reimagined by elected leaders in the open, as the founders intended. Chapter 8. Trump emerging from the White House after the bill signing ceremony. Trump, emerging from the White House after the bill signing ceremony, beamed with unmistakable pride, his shoulders squared, his stride purposeful as he stepped up to the microphones, surrounded by cheering supporters, members of his administration, and a surprisingly mixed group of lawmakers. The spring sun glinted off the presidential seal as cameras clicked in a frenzy. "We've done something amazing," he declared, his voice ringing with the practiced cadence of triumph. "We've given power back to the people, to the states, while protecting our children's future. For too long, education has been dictated by Washington elites, out of touch with the needs of real Americans. Today, that ends. Today, the parents, the teachers, the communities, they take the reins." He gestured to the bipartisan crowd behind him, adding, "This is what winning looks like. We kept our promises, we delivered real change, and we did it by bringing people together." The moment was carefully choreographed but deeply symbolic, a celebration not just of policy, but of political survival and reinvention. For Trump, the signing represented more than just the culmination of a campaign promise. It was the latest proof of his ability to command the spotlight, set the agenda, and outmaneuver his adversaries, even when cornered. On the other side of the political aisle, Senator Chuck Schumer stood in his office watching the live broadcast with a more measured expression. He hadn't gotten everything he wanted, far from it. He had entered the fight hoping to stop Trump's plan cold, to preserve the Department of Education in its entirety, and to deal a blow to what he saw as a creeping erosion of federal responsibility. But politics, he knew, was rarely about absolutes. It was about leverage, about preventing worst-case scenarios, about holding the line where it mattered most. And by that measure, Schumer knew he had achieved something significant. He had forced Trump to the negotiating table, had helped write safeguards into the bill that preserved civil rights protections, ensured funding equity, and maintained federal oversight mechanisms that couldn't be erased with a single stroke of a pen. Most importantly, he had prevented the complete dismantling of the Department of Education, a move that would have disproportionately harmed the nation's most vulnerable students. The bill wasn't perfect, but it was livable. It was sustainable. It ensured that even as power shifted to the states, the federal government retained a meaningful role in protecting the foundational right to education. And perhaps most importantly, it reaffirmed the principle that no president, not even one as singular and unorthodox as Trump, could bypass the constitutional guardrails put in place to prevent unilateral governance. In the end, the battle over the Department of Education became something larger than a policy dispute. It became a testament to the enduring strength and resilience of the American system, a vivid illustration of how, even in an age of hyperpolarization, compromise and common ground could still be found when leaders were willing to fight, to negotiate, and, ultimately, to govern. The legislative showdown became a case study in modern statecraft, where institutional preservation met populist reform, and where the ideological fault lines of a divided nation gave way, if only briefly, to pragmatism. Trump, the master strategist, had once again navigated a treacherous political landscape and emerged victorious, not through brute force alone, but through adaptation. He had shaped the outcome to his benefit, transformed a brewing crisis into a moment of leadership, and proved yet again that even in the face of fierce opposition, his vision for America, decentralized, defiant, and deeply rooted in populist energy, could not only survive but thrive. As the dust settled and the cameras clicked, both parties walked away claiming victory, and in that rarest of Washington moments, perhaps both were right. The nation, battered but intact, continued forward.